Welcome back. Add another Democrat to the list of House members supporting an impeachment inquiry. Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi announced his support today. That brings our NBC tally to 133 Democrats, along with independent and former Republican Justin Amash. The question of impeachment is going to be it could be at the top of the agenda when Congress comes back from its summer recess, even with a growing number of her members supporting an impeachment inquiry. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi remains against it, but isn't ruling it out entirely. She told her caucus on Friday, quote, "If and when we act, people will know he gave us no choice. If he cannot respect the Constitution, we will have to deal with that. It's about patriotism, not partisanship." With me now is Congressman Gerry Connolly of Virginia. He's a member of the House Oversight Committee. He is one of those 133 Democrats who support an impeachment inquiry. Congressman, thank you for joining us. You and your colleagues are... Thank you. So you and your colleagues are due back in a couple weeks to Washington, maybe a little bit less. Is this at the top of the agenda, deciding whether to move forward with an impeachment inquiry?
If it's not at the top of the agenda, Steve, it's certainly moving up to the top of the agenda. It can no longer be ignored. We're going to have to deal with it as a caucus and as a Congress.
When practically speaking, do you have to make a decision by, do you think, to kick things off to, these are long inquiries, at least they can be. When do you have to make that decision as a caucus, yes or no?
My guess is we're going to have to make that decision by this fall, in the October, early November kind of time frame. But I wouldn't put an absolute, timestamp on it, because this is a moving target. When Andrew Johnson was impeached, it was after 3 or 4 unsuccessful attempts, and it occurred in his last year in office. So, we got to let the process unfold. But I think there's growing dissatisfaction with the fact that we have not yet formally taken action, and the time has come to do that.
In terms of the polling on this, we've been talking a lot about the Monmouth poll tonight. Monmouth did ask the question about public attitudes on impeachment. You can see 41% right now supporting, of all Americans here, 41% supporting impeachment, a majority, a small majority, but a majority, 51% saying no. Should that factor into your decision making at all?
I do note, by the way, that that's one of the narrowest margins on the question of impeachment I've seen. So that means more people are changing their minds about it. But I don't think we can be guided by that. If you frame the issue, Steve, politically as a Democrat, you don't vote for impeachment because the downsides are obvious and they're many. But if you frame the issue as I'm a member of Congress who took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution, irrespective of the partisan fallout or political fallout, what is my duty? And when we look at the behavior in this White House by this president, who has debased the office, disparaged fellow Americans in the most demeaning of ways, has incited bigotry, racism, and even violence, has flouted the Constitution and defied the will of the legislative branch and its oversight duties, I feel it's incumbent upon us, frankly, to initiate impeachment proceedings. In fact, I'm not quite sure what other choice we have.
You mentioned the political downsides that you say could come with supporting impeachment. Is it your sense? Let me ask it this way: the leadership of the Democratic caucus, is that on their minds at all from the standpoint of, hey, we the Democrats just won back this majority after nearly a decade of being the minority party here, got all these incumbents who are going to be up in 2020 in swing districts, in marginal districts, maybe even in Republican districts. You have to take their political safety into consideration.
I think that's right, and I think that's proper. Everybody has to come to this decision, frankly, on her or his own terms, as a matter of conscience and political analysis. But I think Nancy Pelosi, in particular, has been playing her role, which is caution, prudence, make it methodical, make it fact-based, don't rush into it, don't be perceived as rushing into it. This is a very grave matter. It is, arguably the single most potent punitive measure provided in the Constitution in terms of checks on the executive by the legislative branch. And I think she's quite proper to say, let's be careful, let's be, robust and thorough before we take action.
I should mention we're having this conversation about whether Democrats should or will launch an impeachment inquiry. You have the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler from New York, saying, oh, no, my committee is already engaged in an impeachment inquiry. What do you make of what he's saying?
Well, I think from his perspective on the Judiciary Committee, that is what they have already launched. And he's announced that, and his committee apparently, I'm not on that committee, but his committee apparently certainly concurs. And so I think de facto, he's right. The question is, do we need to take a formal action de jure as the Congress? I think that's a wise way to go at some point. But I wouldn't gainsay what Chairman Nadler said. Their committee is, in fact, in the midst of an impeachment inquiry.
I mean, do you anticipate, I think Nadler had alluded to this or said this, I should say, that his committee will end up taking a vote on whether to recommend impeachment articles. Do you expect the Judiciary Committee this year is going to be voting on that?
I hope so. I think they should, and I welcome Chairman Nadler's leadership in that regard. He's right.
All right, Congressman Jerry Connolly, Democrat from Virginia. Thank you, as always, for joining us.
Thank you, Steve.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.